My brother tapped the 8-minute countdown on the flight simulator and told the room that when it reached 0, 37 military families would lose the only medical airlift program they could afford. "Put my jet on the runway before the clock dies, Avery, and I'll sign the 10-year hangar extension," Graham said, loud enough for the donors, investors, reporters, and board members gathered inside Cole Aviation's glass-walled training center to hear him. Miss it, and the locks change at midnight. My father stood beside him with one hand in his tuxedo pocket, looking pleased with the arrangement. My mother watched from the front row as if my humiliation were the evening's entertainment. Behind Graham, his chief test pilot, a former air racing champion named Logan Price, adjusted his headset and smiled at me from the second simulator station. The emergency scenario was supposed to be secret, but I already knew what my brother expected the audience to see. Logan, the polished civilian professional, landing smoothly while his estranged little sister panicked in a machine she did not understand. Graham had spent the entire week calling me a weekend helicopter driver and telling anyone who would listen that flying Army MEDEVAC missions did not make me a real aviator. He had also spent that week preparing to take the hangar from Homefront Lift, the nonprofit I had built with wounded service members and military spouses. Without that hangar, our planes would be grounded, our maintenance agreement would collapse, and children like 9-year-old Eli Dawson would lose their rides to specialists hundreds of miles from home. Judge Elaine Brooks, the only independent trustee on our family foundation's board, held up the signed agreement Graham had been arrogant enough to place in escrow. If I won, the lease extension became effective immediately, and $300,000 moved into Homefront Lift's protected operating account. He could not cancel it, stop payment, or change the terms after the fact. I had insisted on that before I touched the controls. Graham leaned close enough for me to smell the bourbon on his breath and whispered, "You should have stayed away from this family." I looked past him at my father, who had taught Graham that possession was the same thing as merit, and at my mother, who had spent my childhood turning silence into an art form. Then I climbed into the simulator, fastened the harness, and settled my hands on the controls. "Tell Logan not to get comfortable," I said. 8 minutes is a long time to watch someone else take your place. 22 years earlier, Graham and I had stood on the same airfield with very different futures already chosen for us. My father, Richard Cole, had inherited 3 aging charter planes from his own father and turned them into Cole Aviation, the largest private aviation company in eastern North Carolina. By the time I was 10, our family name was painted on hangars, fuel trucks, scholarship plaques, and the side of a terminal at Raleigh Executive Airfield. Graham was 7 years older than me, broad-shouldered, charming, and certain from childhood that everything bearing our name would eventually belong to him. My father took him into cockpits before he was tall enough to see over the instrument panel. He bought Graham his first flight hours at 14 and introduced him to clients as the next generation. I was introduced as our daughter Avery, usually followed by a comment about how quiet I was. I loved aircraft more than Graham did, but I loved them differently. He loved the attention they brought him. I loved the order inside them. Every switch had a purpose. Every warning meant something. In a cockpit, a person could not dismiss a problem because it was inconvenient or emotional. Either the system worked or it did not. Either the crew communicated or people got hurt. At 13, I began spending afternoons with Luis Ortega, an Army veteran who managed our maintenance shop. He taught me to read inspection logs, trace hydraulic lines, and listen for small changes in an engine's rhythm. My father found me there one evening with grease on my jeans and a flashlight between my teeth. He did not ask what I had learned. He told Luis, "Don't encourage her. Graham will run this place. Avery needs to find something more suitable." Graham heard him and laughed. A month later, he took the balsa wood MEDEVAC helicopter model I had built for a statewide engineering competition and flew it from the roof of the maintenance office after cutting one of the support struts. It broke apart on the concrete in front of me. When I demanded that he explain himself, he shrugged and said, "If it couldn't survive a fall, it wasn't built well." My father called it a lesson. My mother told me not to ruin dinner by sulking. I gathered the pieces alone, and Luis helped me rebuild the model after everyone went home. He said, "Machines fail honestly, kid. People are the ones who lie about why." I carried that sentence with me for years. I stopped asking my family for permission when I was 18. I earned an Army ROTC scholarship, studied mechanical engineering, completed flight training, and eventually became a UH-60 Black Hawk pilot in a National Guard MEDEVAC unit. By 32, I had served for more than a decade, completed 2 overseas deployments, and earned my captain's bars through the same ordinary path every officer had to follow: school, training, evaluations, mistakes, more training, and time. Nothing about it was instant. Nothing was handed to me because of my last name. The Army stripped away the part of me that still believed confidence had to be loud. My first aircraft commander, Chief Warrant Officer Dana Whitfield, spoke softly enough that everyone leaned closer when she gave an order. She taught me that the calmest person in an emergency often controlled the outcome. My flight medic, Sergeant First Class Victoria Hayes, taught me something harder. Tori could keep a wounded soldier alive while the aircraft shook, alarms sounded, and the ground below us disappeared under dust. During a flood response in Louisiana, she worked for 19 straight hours without raising her voice once. During my second deployment, an explosion damaged our aircraft on a landing zone and injured Tori's left leg beyond repair. We got her home, but the Army could not give her the life she had before. What it gave her instead was a medical retirement, a stack of appointments, and long weeks in which she had to learn how to trust her own body again. While she recovered, I watched other military families travel overnight for specialized treatment, sleep in airport chairs, or cancel appointments because commercial tickets cost more than their monthly rent. I watched young spouses manage children, medical files, deployments, and jobs without anyone asking what help they needed. Tori and I began Homefront Lift with 1 donated twin-engine plane, 6 volunteer pilots, and a list of families who had already run out of options. My grandmother, Margaret Cole, had been the only person in my family who treated service as something more than a word printed on a gala program. Before she died, she directed the family foundation to lease an unused maintenance hangar to Homefront Lift for 12 years at $1 annually. The lease was written, recorded, and approved by the board. For 4 years, we operated from that hangar without missing an inspection or payment. We transported wounded veterans, Gold Star parents, military children, and rural patients referred by partner hospitals. Tori ran operations from a carbon fiber prosthetic and an office covered with route maps. Luis, long retired from Cole Aviation, supervised maintenance. I flew with the program when my military schedule allowed and served as its unpaid safety director. It was the first place I had ever built that felt like home. 3 weeks before the gala, Graham announced a $70 million expansion of Cole Aviation's luxury terminal. The plans required our hangar, our ramp space, and the access road used by our families. He could not simply remove us because the lease still had 8 years remaining, so he created a reason. A fire suppression contractor submitted a report claiming our foam system had failed inspection and that Homefront Lift had denied access for repairs. The Family Foundation's bylaws allowed the board to terminate a lease for an uncured material safety violation after 72 hours. Graham scheduled the termination vote for the night of my parents' 40th anniversary gala, when reporters and investors would already be present for the expansion announcement. He expected the board to accept the report, cancel our lease, and hand him the property before anyone looked closely. The problem was that Tori looked closely at everything. She found the electronic access record showing the contractor had entered our hangar twice during the period he claimed we had locked him out. Luis found the pressure test certificate signed after the alleged failure. I called the contractor directly and learned that the technician who had performed the inspection had been ordered by his supervisor to replace the original report with a different version. The technician was frightened, but when Judge Brooks agreed to protect his identity and refer the matter to the appropriate authorities, he signed an affidavit. We also discovered that Graham had delayed replacement of the airfield's emergency generator to keep the expansion project under budget. The generator powered runway approach lights, weather sensors, and part of the emergency communications system during an outage. He had described the delay in an internal email as an acceptable short-term exposure. My father had approved it. When I confronted him by phone, he did not deny the documents. He said, "Your brother is trying to secure the future of this company. You are protecting a charity that burns money." I told him the charity had transported 86 patients that year. He answered, "That is not a business model." Then Graham took the phone and offered the simulator challenge. He said the board would enjoy seeing whether the family embarrassment could perform under pressure. I knew he expected me to refuse. I also knew that refusing would let him tell the room I had no confidence in my own training. So, I accepted under 3 conditions. The lease extension and operating funds had to be signed and placed in third-party escrow before the challenge. Logan and I had to receive the same unknown emergency scenario, and Judge Brooks had to be permitted to present our safety evidence before any final board vote. Graham agreed because he believed none of it would matter after I failed in public. The next morning, Tori drove me to the airfield and watched me stand outside the hangar while volunteers loaded a small overnight bag for Eli Dawson. Eli was the son of a Marine staff sergeant deployed overseas. He had a congenital kidney condition and needed evaluation at a children's hospital in Durham before his doctors could place him on a transplant list. His mother, Jenna, had postponed the trip twice because of cost and work. Homefront Lift was scheduled to bring them back on gala night. Eli leaned out of the plane before departure and called, "Captain Cole, don't let them take our hangar." I promised him I would not, then spent the rest of the day making sure that promise rested on more than courage. The gala filled the training center with people who had spent years pretending our family's success had no casualties. My mother wore silver and greeted guests beneath a display of photographs that showed Graham beside every aircraft the company had purchased since he became chief executive. There was not a single picture of me in uniform. My father stood near a model of the new terminal, explaining how the expansion would bring prestige to the region. When I entered wearing my Army service uniform, conversations slowed. Some guests recognized the rank on my shoulders. Others only recognized that I had arrived without a gown. Tori came beside me in a dark suit, her prosthetic visible below the hem of her trousers because she had stopped designing her clothes around other people's discomfort. Luis carried the original inspection file. Judge Brooks waited near the simulators with the escrow attorney. My mother intercepted me before I reached them. "You did not need to come dressed like that," she said. "This is a family event." I looked at the photographs behind her. "Then I'm dressed correctly. The Army is my family." Her expression tightened. But before she could answer, Graham took the microphone and welcomed everyone to what he called a friendly test of skill. He introduced Logan with a list of awards, air show appearances, and corporate endorsements. Then he introduced me as his little sister, a National Guard helicopter pilot who had developed a generous opinion of her own abilities. A few people laughed. Many did not. Colonel James Mercer, a retired Air Force officer and one of the company's largest investors, folded his arms and stared at Graham. A local reporter lifted her phone and began recording. My father remained beside the terminal model, his face unreadable. Judge Brooks read the challenge terms aloud and confirmed that the lease extension and $300,000 were held in escrow. Graham tried to interrupt when she mentioned that the result would be binding, but the attorney handed him the agreement bearing his own signature. I took my seat in the left simulator. Logan sat in the right station behind a partition so neither of us could see the other's display. The scenario loaded. A mid-size business jet at night, heavy rain, crosswind near limits, one engine degraded, hydraulic pressure falling, and an airport reporting intermittent runway lighting. It was a difficult emergency, but it was not a trick. Logan had more hours in that aircraft than I did. What he did not have was a crew. Graham had designed the contest as a solo performance because he believed great pilots proved themselves alone. The Army had taught me the opposite. I used the virtual co-pilot, called for checklists, identified what could still be controlled, and refused to waste time fighting the systems that had already failed. Logan pushed for speed. I heard his engine warning through the partition, and then the impact alarm when he attempted a high-energy approach. His simulator reset once, which added a penalty. I stabilized early, accepted a longer final approach, and kept enough altitude to correct for the crosswind without forcing the aircraft onto the runway. When my wheels touched down, the timer showed 1 minute and 12 seconds remaining. The room went silent before the applause began. Logan emerged from his station at 7 minutes and 39 seconds, pale and angry. Graham stepped toward the control desk and said there had been a software discrepancy. Judge Brooks held up the independent technician's verification. "There was no discrepancy," she said. Captain Cole completed the scenario first. The escrow attorney reached for the release authorization, and for one clean second, I thought the worst part of the night was over. Then every light in the training center flickered. The screens went black. Emergency strips came on along the floor, and somewhere beyond the glass, the runway vanished into darkness. A storm cell had crossed the field faster than forecast. The backup generator should have restored the approach lights and weather equipment within 10 seconds. It did not. An alarm began sounding from the operations room. The airport manager ran through the crowd, shouting that an inbound aircraft had declared an emergency. I knew the tail number before he said it. Homefront Lift 27 was returning with Eli and Jenna Dawson on board. The pilot, a former Coast Guard aviator named Marcus Hill, had reported an electrical failure and severe turbulence. He had enough fuel for one approach before he would be forced to divert, but the nearest alternate field had just closed its runway because of wind damage. Cole Airfield was his only practical option, and the lights were out. Graham grabbed the airport manager's arm and demanded that he keep the radio traffic away from the guests. The manager pulled free. "There's a child on that airplane." My father looked toward the dark runway, then toward the model of the terminal, as if he were trying to understand how his decisions had become visible. I took off my uniform jacket, handed it to Tori, and ran for the operations room. Graham followed, yelling that I had no authority there. Colonel Mercer followed him. So did the reporter, Judge Brooks, Luis, several pilots, and half the board. The rest of the guests remained in the training center, some frightened, some embarrassed, and a few still filming. Inside operations, Marcus's voice broke through the static. He had partial instruments, unstable voltage, and difficulty confirming his landing gear position. The runway edge lights were dead. Portable emergency lights were stored in a maintenance shed, but the electric door would not open without the generator. Luis sent 2 mechanics with a manual release bar. Tori called County Fire and Rescue, then the State Emergency Operations Center. My guard unit was conducting storm readiness duty at a regional armory 12 miles away, with 1 UH-60 configured for rescue and a crew already on alert. I called our operations officer, gave him the situation, and asked for activation through the state duty chain. I did not command the mission simply because my family owned the field. We waited for authorization while the airport manager kept Marcus on a holding pattern he could barely maintain. Graham stood in the doorway, wet hair falling across his forehead, and said, "If that plane lands here and crashes, the liability will destroy us." Tori turned toward him so slowly that everyone heard the click of her prosthetic foot on the floor. "A child may die, and you're worried about the company." Graham looked at our father for support. My father said nothing. The state authorized the guard response within 4 minutes. My crew chief, Warrant Officer Beth Nguyen, called and told me the aircraft was starting. I had flown with Beth for 6 years. She did not ask whether I was emotionally involved. She asked for wind, visibility, and patient count. I gave her the facts. Then I told Marcus to remain north of the field as long as he safely could. "We're bringing you lights and rescue coverage," I said. His reply came through static. "Captain, I've got 1 approach left." I looked through the operations room glass at the runway, hidden by rain, and answered, "Then we'll make it the only one you need." By the time I reached the guard helicopter, the rain had turned the ramp into a sheet of moving water. Beth was in the right seat. Our crew chief and flight medic secured in back, and the state mission number had been received. I took the left seat, ran the abbreviated checks, and lifted into a sky that seemed determined to erase the ground. We were not going to guide Marcus like an air traffic controller or perform some impossible stunt beside his wing. Our job was simpler and more important: locate him, confirm his position, illuminate the field if the portable lights failed, and be ready to recover survivors if he went down. The mechanics opened the maintenance shed manually and began placing portable runway lights along the first half of the pavement. County fire trucks positioned at both ends. The storm knocked 1 light cart over before it could be secured. From the helicopter, we found Marcus, 3 miles north, lower than I wanted and fighting the wind. His aircraft appeared on our sensors as a small moving heat source against the rain. I radioed his position to the tower and kept our helicopter clear of his approach path. The airport manager confirmed that enough portable lights were active to mark the threshold and centerline. Marcus turned inbound. His landing gear indicator remained uncertain. I heard Jenna crying in the background when he transmitted. Eli was awake but frightened. I told Marcus what my own instructors had told me during my first emergency. "Fly the aircraft you still have, not the one you wish you had." He acknowledged once. Then lightning struck near the field, and the remaining terminal power failed. The radio cut for 2 seconds that felt like a lifetime. When it returned, Marcus was too low and drifting left. Beth called the deviation before I did. I relayed it through the tower. Marcus corrected. but the crosswind pushed him again. His right main gear touched first, bounced, and collapsed. The aircraft veered from the runway, crossed the wet grass, and disappeared into the drainage marsh beyond the lights. Fire crews moved, but the ground near the wreck was too soft for their heaviest vehicle. We were already turning. I placed the Black Hawk into a hover over the marsh while the crew chief directed me around trees and power lines. Smoke rose from the aircraft, thin at first, then darker. The cabin door had jammed against the mud. Our medic and crew chief descended by hoist with extraction tools. I held the hover while gusts shoved at the tail and rain blurred the windshield. There was no room for anger, childhood memories, or the fact that my brother's neglected generator had helped create the situation. There was only altitude, position, torque, communication, and the people below us. Marcus came out first with blood on his forehead and one arm hanging badly. Jenna followed, coughing and trying to turn back toward the cabin. Eli was trapped by a deformed seat frame. The smoke thickened. Beth monitored power while I kept the aircraft steady. Our medic cut the frame, covered Eli with her body, and signaled for the hoist. The cable rose slowly through the rotor wash. Eli appeared beneath us in a rescue strop, his small hands locked around the medic's harness. When they reached the cabin, he looked through the open door toward me and shouted over the noise. "You kept the hangar!" I laughed once, though my throat had closed. "We're working on it," I told him. We carried all 3 survivors to the hospital, where Marcus was treated for a broken arm and concussion, Jenna for smoke inhalation, and Eli for minor cuts. I remained long enough for an Army flight surgeon to examine my shoulder after the long hover aggravated an old training injury. He restricted me from flying for 48 hours and ordered imaging. I obeyed him because ignoring an injury would not have made me brave. It would only have endangered my crew on the next mission. By dawn, the gala had become evidence. The local reporter's footage showed Graham trying to suppress the emergency radio traffic. The airport logs showed the generator had failed exactly as Luis had warned. The maintenance emails showed Graham and my father had delayed replacement after receiving 3 written notices. The fire suppression technician's affidavit established that the report against Homefront Lift had been altered. Judge Brooks convened an emergency board session at the hospital with counsel present. Graham arrived with 2 attorneys and demanded that the simulator result be voided because the evening had not concluded under normal conditions. The escrow attorney answered that the conditions had been completed before the power failure and that the release was already effective. Homefront Lift's 10-year lease extension had been recorded electronically at 9:42 p.m. The $300,000 had transferred into the protected account 3 minutes later. Graham could not touch either one. The board then suspended him as chief executive pending an independent investigation. My father was asked to resign as board chairman after the emails proved he had approved the maintenance delay and supported the false lease termination. He stared at the table for a long time before signing the resignation. My mother attempted to call the entire matter a tragic misunderstanding until Tori asked her which part she misunderstood. The falsified inspection, the failed generator, the child in the marsh, or her son's decision to protect a gala instead of an airplane. My mother had no answer. Colonel Mercer and 2 other investors funded the immediate generator replacement and demanded outside safety oversight as a condition of remaining with the company. The aviation authorities opened their own reviews. I did not predict criminal charges, promise prison, or turn the investigation into a victory speech. I gave statements, submitted documents, and let the process move at the speed evidence required. Graham's consequences did not arrive as one dramatic sentence. They came as contracts paused, sponsors withdrew, board access disappeared, and people who had once laughed at his jokes stopped returning his calls. Logan Price resigned before noon and provided investigators with additional maintenance records. My father came to the hospital that afternoon and stood outside Eli's room. He looked older than he had the night before. "I thought I was protecting what I built," he said. I told him, "You protected Graham from consequences. That is not the same thing." He asked whether I would help rebuild the company. I looked through the window at Eli sleeping while Jenna spoke by phone to her deployed husband. "I already built something," I said. "You just never valued it because it wasn't yours." He began to apologize, but I stopped him. I was not ready to forgive him, and I would not perform reconciliation because he finally felt ashamed. I gave him the name of the independent investigator and told him cooperation was the first useful thing he could do. Then I returned to Eli's room. 3 months later, Homefront Lift opened the renovated section of Hangar 12. Donations that arrived after the rescue allowed us to add a patient lounge, a second maintenance bay, and an apartment where families could sleep before early departures. We did not name the building after me. We named it the Luis Ortega Operations Center because the man who taught me to trust honest records had protected our organization when powerful people tried to replace facts with influence. Tori hung the original fire suppression certificate in a frame inside her office, not as decoration but as a reminder that small documents can defend large truths. Marcus returned with his arm healed and accepted a ground training position until his doctors cleared him to fly again. Eli completed his transplant evaluation and later received the call that a donor kidney had become available. Homefront Lift carried him and his mother to Durham before sunrise. I was still serving with my guard unit, still flying MEDEVAC missions, and still subject to the same check rides, duty schedules, and regulations as every other Army aviator. The rescue did not turn me into a legend. It reminded me why discipline mattered when a room full of people wanted spectacle. My mother wrote twice. My father attended safety hearings and began answering questions he had spent years avoiding. Graham never contacted me directly. None of that determined whether my life was whole. On the morning we reopened the hangar, military families filled the ramp while volunteers prepared 2 flights. Eli stood near the doorway wearing a Homefront Lift cap that covered most of his hair. He pointed toward the new lease plaque and asked, "Did you beat your brother in that simulator?" I knelt beside him and said, "Yes, but that wasn't the important part." He frowned the way children do when adults make simple things complicated. Then what was? I looked across the hangar at Tori, checking a manifest, Louise arguing with a mechanic about a torque wrench, Marcus teaching a young volunteer how to inspect a tire, and Jenna laughing with another military mother who had arrived scared and exhausted. The important part, I told him, was making sure he never got to decide who deserved help. Eli considered that, then nodded and ran toward the passenger lounge. A few minutes later, the first aircraft rolled into the sunlight. I stood at the edge of the ramp in my Army flight suit and watched it lift above the tree line, carrying a wounded veteran to a treatment center his family could not have reached alone. For most of my childhood, I believed family was the group of people whose approval I could never earn. The Army taught me that trust is built through responsibility. Homefront Lift taught me that belonging is built through service. My brother had believed the hangar was valuable because he could own the ground beneath it. He never understood that its real value was measured in every person who walked through its doors believing someone would come for them.